hard to find good stringed instruments for under thousands of dollars. There are people who are making modern instruments, and some of which are very, very good. But even those are expensive. But now, I mean, if you're a musician starting out, there's just no way, unless you have a very wealthy family or wealthy backers or whatever, to buy one of the great old names, because they're just out of sight. Instruments that 10 years ago were $35,000 are now $150,000. The asking price on this instrument is $22,000, which makes it very moderately priced, extremely moderately priced, which sounds crazy. But in order for me to buy this instrument, I have to borrow some money for a down payment plus sell my other instrument, and you know, there's no way to just... Hi. I understand. All the traditions were handed down and developed. So this is Italian, made in, well, it's hard to say, because a lot of these guys, when these instruments were made, they got $30 for them or $50 for them, and this instrument was made by a man named Gaetano Gadda, who studied with a man named Stefano Scarampella. Now, Scarampella was a very well-known instrument maker. Gadda worked in his shop. Gadda put a Scarampella label in this viola to try to sell it as a Scarampella, which undoubtedly was sold as a Scarampella originally, which means that he would have gotten a few extra bucks for it. Now, of course, the difference is between $20 and $50 and between $20,000 and $50,000. It's very interesting. But there are people, there are experts who know instruments so well that they look at this instrument and say, ah, well, that's a Gadda with a Scarampella label in it, because they know Gadda's work and they know Scarampella's work. And it seems strange, but I've seen people pick up instruments and thinking, oh yeah, that's a such and such, or such and such, and they know. They're right. And they can tell by the carving, by the shape, by the arching, by the color of the varnish, by the workmanship, by all sorts of things, by the way the scroll is carved. So, actually, I guess we've started. It's an interesting place to start with the instrument. I'm a musician. This is what I do. If we're talking about good gifts, what are these gifts? Music, being a musician. And one of the ways to think about all the issues that have to do with music and instruments and playing is this issue of tradition and how things got started, how things got continued, kept continued, why we continue them, what's the appeal, what's the importance. And by the way, please feel free to ask questions at any time, interrupt me. I'd like this to feel as informal as possible rather than a lecture. The tradition of making instruments is hundreds of years old. Nobody knows when the first violin was made. The first stringed instruments came over from Asia and from the Middle East, and somewhere in the 1500s the shape of the violin was standardized. This is a viola. I should have brought a violin in too. The violin comes up to about here on a viola. Violin is smaller, viola is bigger. And all these words are from Italian. Viola means viol, it's a stringed instrument. Violin comes from the word violino, which means small viola. So the generic term is actually viola and violino. Now you all have seen a cello, which is the big version which you play sitting down. Well, cello is a fascinating word because in Italian the way you make the suffix that you add onto a word to make it big is one. So if you want to say a big viola, you say violone. And one of the diminutives that you can add in Italian is ello, to make a little one. Like, well, another one is S, like prince, princessa, right? The count, countessa, it makes it feminine, makes it diminutive. Ello or ella, like Cinderella, that means a little spark, or a little ash, I believe. Well, violone is the word for big viola. Violoncello makes it a diminutive, so a cello is a little big viola. It's the traditions here are crazy because there is an instrument called the violone, which is actually very, very big. It's more like a double bass. But what has gone in to the making of these instruments in terms of hundreds of years of tradition is really fascinating. That just the woods that are used in an instrument like this. The back is maple. You can see the flame. This is cut in a particular way, and these two pieces are glued together. It's all carved to very specific thicknesses on the inside. If you took an instrument like this apart, what these instruments are mainly made out of is air. It's just a very thin plate of wood top and a thin plate of wood on the bottom. Now the top is generally made out of spruce, which is a kind of pine tree. It's a soft wood. And the ribs, these are called the ribs, are also made out of maple, which is also a hardwood. So maple is hard, the top is soft, and the back has to be hard because it's bearing an enormous amount of pressure. This is called the bridge. The strings go over the bridge. This bridge is not kept in place by anything but the pressure of the strings. Now there's also a little dowel on the inside, just a little post. It's called the sound post. Although it's interesting, in French, the word for sound post is soul, l'âme it's called. It's the soul of the instrument, which is interesting because it communicates the vibrations between the top plate and the back plate. But the pressure communicated through the strings, through the sound post to the back, is tremendous. These instruments have to be very, very strong. You can't pick that string up off the bridge because of the pressure that's on it. It's a tremendous amount of pressure. So you have spruce, you have maple. This is all hand carved. The pegs might be ebony or they might be rosewood. These happen to be particularly ugly pegs. I mentioned that I'm just buying this viola and I really don't like the pegs at all, and I'd like to get them replaced. The only thing that keeps the pegs from slipping inside the holes is how well the holes are carved and matched to the size of the peg. So this is all done by hand and all done with exactitude. There's no glue or screws or anything holding any of that in. It's all carving. You might be able to see these little double black line around the edge. Can you see that? I don't know if that's visible. Can you see the double black line that goes around the edge instrument? Sorry, Paul. That's not ink. That's not drawn on that. That's inlaid. That's wood. That's ebony probably, that's inlaid in channels that are hand cut. Now, that's not easy to do. That's part of the craftsmanship. As a matter of fact, the man who made this Gada was not exactly what you'd call a fabulous craftsman. That double line is called the purfling, and the purfling on this instrument is basically pretty ugly. It's Gada's claim to fame was the way his instrument sounded, not particularly how wonderful his craftsmanship was. The same with Scarampella, his teacher. Scarampella instruments, compared to the works of the great craftsmen, were not particularly beautiful. The fingerboard, this big piece of black wood, is usually ebony or sometimes rosewood. This is called the tailpiece. That's another kind of wood. This is the chin rest. That's another kind of wood. The bridge is made out of another kind of wood. Just the materials that go into this and the form and the shape are the result of hundreds of years of development of tradition. And one of the wonderful things about playing a stringed instrument is to be the inheritor, the bearer of this kind of tradition. You have an instrument like this in your hand and you're dealing with something that took a long time to develop, that took thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours of craftsmen all over the world developing models that worked, that sounded better, trying to figure out how and why something would sound better, experimenting with varnish, experimenting with carving, experimenting with the shape of arching, with the shape of the instrument, all that sort of thing. The bow. All fine bows in the world are made out of only one kind of wood. It's called Pernambuco. Pernambuco may sound familiar to some of you. It's a region of Brazil. And Pernambuco is a kind of very dense Brazil wood. This wood is so dense that if you take a block of it and throw it in the water, it sinks. That's how dense it is. This wood does not float. It's got to be extremely strong and yet very flexible. It's got to be able to bend, but it's also got to be light enough to use. The carving of a bow is a matter of remarkable craftsmanship because every bow feels different, every bow sounds different. The The delicate balance between being able to do something delicate and easy with the bow and something very strong requires a lot of this thin little piece of wood. Now the hair is horsehair, hair from the tail of a horse. Most of it comes from probably Siberia nowadays, although it's a very mysterious process because there are lots of steps in before the hair gets here and on the bow. There are people who cut the hair from the horse. Then they sell it to dressers. It's called dressers, people who bathe the hair in acid or whatever, get all the impurities out. Those people sell it to dealers, and those dealers sell it to other dealers who eventually sell it to bow hair people here, so that when you get this hair, you kind of have a vague idea where it comes from, but there have been so many steps that it's a little mysterious. And there's actually a very interesting story about Brazil wood. The wood is not named after the country. It's the other way around. The country is named after the wood. Brazil is a word that came from a Latin word which came from a Persian word. This wood was originally and still is used as a dye wood. When Pernambuco, Brazil wood, gets wet, it gives off a purplish dye. As a matter of fact, the reason bows are made from it is because of the granddaddy of the great bow makers, a man named François Tourte in Paris, Tourte, was walking along the docks in Paris, and he saw this shipment of Pernambuco wood that had come from Brazil. It was being used for dye wood, and he started experimenting, making bows from it, and now all bows are made from it. But the word in, I believe it's Persian, for red, or fire, fiery red, sounds something like Brazil, or I don't know what the original word is. At any rate, it was the trade in this wood came from the Middle East through the Mediterranean, through Spain and Portugal. The Spanish and the Portuguese, well, in Latin it was called Brazilium, or something close to that. The Portuguese called it Brazil. The Spanish also something like that. Then when the Portuguese went on their voyage of discovery and they landed in South America, they found on the coast of South America these great hardwood forests with the same kind of wood that they had been dealing with in trade from the Middle East. And it was Brazil. It was the same kind of wood. They called the country Brazil because of the wood that was there. It's very interesting. We think of Brazil wood as being called Brazil wood because it comes from Brazil, but in fact it's the other way around. Oh, I was going to take this apart. This is a screw, you can tell, which keeps this piece of wood, which is also ebony, and for some reason, don't ask me why, is called the frog. That keeps it attached to the stick. When it's not attached to the stick, it looks like this. This is just a bunch of horsehair. Now the hair gets replaced every few months as you need it. It's the stick that counts. Now, when you screw this back in here, there's a little eyelet on the inside of the frog, and there's a channel cut in the stick. When you screw this back in, again, you're talking about a tremendous amount of pressure. These bows have to withstand quite a bit. Anyway, those are the tools. The tools are and then you put rosin on the hair to make it stick, so otherwise it would just slide back and forth across the strings. The whole point of all this is to make something vibrate. The strings, well, now that's a whole other story. Strings used to be made out of gut, sheep gut, and just made into a string. Then people began winding metal around to make them last longer, to make them stronger. Nowadays, very often, as is the case with these strings, you have a synthetic material, a plastic, in this case it's called Perlon, with either silver or aluminum wound around it. And they tend to last longer, they sound just as good, they go out of tune much because they're not as affected by changes in humidity and temperature. The top string is actually steel wound on steel. So again, there's so many materials, so many things that have had to develop, that have had to be developed, that have gone into making an instrument. And how is sound created? By vibrations. A vibrating string creates vibrations. The point of the bow is to set the strings in vibration. And believe it or not, the carving of the bow the curvature of the bow, the density of the bow, the kind of wood, how the wood is carved, how it is worked. It makes a tremendous difference in what kind of sound and how easily the sound can be drawn from the instrument. So, hundreds of years of development have gone into just being able to make a nice sound on a stringed instrument that you hold under your chin. Now, you can actually see that what I do with this is, the first thing that happens is the string is actually getting pulled. That's what happens. Just really pull on it, okay? And you'll see it vibrate. It keeps vibrating. Can you see it go back and forth? Yeah, close enough to see that. And the vibrations, what's interesting about music is the physical basis of it. We talk about something being moving. The whole point of music, the reason we all listen to music, is to be moved. The reason composers have always written pieces is to take us on some sort of emotional journey. What's another way to say to be moved? To be touched. And what happens with music, which is quite fascinating, is that we are physically, literally touched. We are literally moved because these vibrations travel through the air, through our ear. They make little hairs vibrate in the inner ear. And then through a complex set of reactions that nobody quite yet understands, and perhaps never will, it makes sense to us. We've developed ways to create sounds that are coherent, but they're a physical thing going on. Vibrations make the air vibrate, make things in your ear vibrate, and you feel it. And that's what's remarkable, I think, about music, in the sense that we can talk, and we will talk, about the intellectual aspects, the artistic aspects, the intentions, the results, but it has a very direct physical component. First of all, there's what I'm doing physically, which is both demanding and remarkably satisfying. And then there is the physical effect of what I'm doing physically, which is fascinating when you think of it. How many interactions, how many things that you're involved in on an intellectual or an artistic level have this direct physical component, not opponent. Hope that wasn't a Freudian slip. A direct physical component. When we say we're touched by music, the first thing that's happening is that we really are being touched. Now, I'm just playing random notes, but what's gone into pieces of music? What's gone into notes that aren't random? Bach. Originally written for cello, it's also played on viola. It's from one of the solo cello suites. Gone into that. Also, hundreds of years of development. This chord, the G major chord, hundreds of years went into the development of what we now call Western harmony to make a G major chord. Harmony with major and minor and scales and all that stuff didn't just spring into being like that. The development of this is a fascinating development, and again, we are the inheritors of this tradition. So while I'm the inheritor and the keeper, it's my duty, that's my responsibility, the keeper of this tradition of working with this remarkable physical thing. And how many of you have ever been that close, actually, to somebody really playing one of these things right next to you? I suspect maybe it's not that common. This is what I've found, that very often we don't have a chance to experience somebody playing an instrument really right next to us. And that physical sensation. Here I am, these are my hands, I'm making this noise. It's right there. You can see physically what I'm doing, you can feel physically what I'm doing. Well, all those chords, all that harmony, all of that is also part of the tradition that musicians have inherited and that musicians try to keep and that musicians try to keep alive. What's the point of listening to a piece of music? Joseph Conrad, the great English, Polish author, felt that human beings had as much of a need for narrative, for story, as for breathing, for air. Well, it may be that human beings also have as much of a need for music as for breathing. Now, that's an interesting idea. If we were at a concert and somebody had a heart attack, obviously it would be more important that there be a doctor in the house than that there be a musician in the house. So, yeah, in any given moment, music is not the difference between life and death. But there's an interesting thought experiment that I like to propose in terms of trying to figure out what role music has for us. Imagine a world without music. Music did not exist. It just wasn't. Well, that's an interesting world. That means that's a world where you can't walk down the street humming a tune or whistling a tune because tunes don't exist. That's a world without lullabies. Right? That means you can't sing a child to sleep. There's no such thing. That means you can't whistle a happy tune. You can't feel good and express it with these physical sensations and physical expressions that we've gotten used to. What does it mean to sing? How did singing get started? Seems like the most natural thing in the world. And actually all of this, everything, starts with singing. It starts with somebody who felt like doing something other than talking. And the first written records we have of things like this are back with the Greeks, but we can probably assume that people did things other than just talk for as long as people have had voices. Now, it might have been shouting originally. It might have been stand up on a hill and say, watch out, the elephants are coming, or the mastodons, or the saber-toothed tigers. But that's how music started. Somebody found that you could do things with the voice other than just talk. All of instrumental music started with vocal music. Somebody ask a question. Yes?
Does the varnish have any impact on like the quality of the music?
Quality of the music or the quality of the sound?
Oh, the sound actually.
Yeah, sure. The study of varnish of stringed instruments is a huge study, matter of great controversy, matter of great differences of opinion, but certainly different makers have different qualities of varnish, and there are many layers of varnish on a stringed instrument. Like there are many layers of tradition involved in all of this. There are many layers of varnish, and nobody has yet to discover the secret of Stradivari's varnish, for example, or the secret of Guarneri's varnish. And nobody can tell for sure what role the varnish does have, but we assume that, as in any work of great craftsmanship, every element of the craftsmanship contributes. If you had an instrument that weren't varnished, it would sound very different. It wouldn't sound good at all. But the varnish is also affected by the vibrations of the instrument. all of the materials that go into this are flexible. The wood, the fibers are flexible. They expand, they contract. By the way, these instruments are kept together. The seams here are very weak glue because with the expansion from humidity and temperature, if anything gives, you want the seam to give. So that it'll just open up, which you can re-glue easily, rather than having the wood crack. So the varnish is flexible, the varnish vibrates, the wood vibrates, everything vibrates. Yeah, the varnish is definitely involved.
Does the sound of the musical instrument change over the years? That may be an unanswerable question of some of these old or ancient. Any idea, is there any information on whether the sound evolves as the way ages?
We assume it does, and certainly people who have bought or played relatively modern instruments can attest to the fact that instruments play in. They do play in, and that's because they're made out of flexible materials. These fibers change and they develop resonances. They align themselves. Things align themselves. It's a little bit mysterious. On the other hand, these aren't quite as dead as they look. You know, things move, things vibrate, things realign. Also, there are things that you can change. If you change the position of that little dowel on the inside, that can change the sound of the instrument enormously. That being said, Stradivari had a pretty good reputation when he was alive, too. And in the 19th century, there were pieces written for people who had just gotten a Stradivarius and were thrilled with it, that they commissioned a famous story with Berlioz, the piece called Harold in Italy, for viola and orchestra. Paganini came into possession of a beautiful Stradivari viola, which now belongs to the Corcoran Gallery, by the way. And he went to Paganini and said, "Hey, I got this great Stradivarius, write me a piece." And that was in the mid-1800s. So Stradivariuses have been sounding great for a long time. How they change over time, it's hard to tell exactly, but certainly they do change. And also, other things can affect it. If an instrument has been kept in a case with lights shining on it for 200 years, this is the case with some famous instruments, they can probably die, too, because they haven't been played, they haven't had a chance to breathe, and the light has maybe destroyed the varnish or dried something out. There are all sorts of possibilities.
I'm really fascinated by the series of points you made. This idea of the instrument having a soul in it. I came across that someplace. I've written a play in which a black jazz musician whom I met in New Orleans, I put him into the play, and I gave him a big set speech on the soul of his instrument. Exactly, talking about that post-piece.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about topics which literally resonate in my mind.
Yeah.
This apprentice tradition is, and your points about tradition, something that's carried down, something that's a good gift that's given across time, is extremely important, particularly in our era, because in our academies, there's a lot of neurotic blockage, and there's a lot of effort to get rid of the tradition because it's allegedly privileged and so forth and so on. And we're supposed to level everything and start it from scratch. Actually,
it's a privilege to carry on certain traditions, and I think that's the important point. And we all learn so much from our teachers. I learned the traditions of playing a stringed instrument from somebody who had learned the traditions from his teacher and her teacher, and I mean, I had more than one teacher. And you feel this connection. There's one of the violinists in the group that I direct, the American Chamber Players, is from Paris. His grandmother gave him his first violin lessons. His grandmother was an early student at a school called the School Cantorum in Paris. Her teacher was a French composer named Vincent Dandy, D''I''N''D''Y. He was a very well-known, not a great composer, but a very well-known French composer. He was the protege, the disciple of César Franck, who was a very well-known and a wonderful French composer. Well, it was quite remarkable when in our group we played the Franck Quintet for piano and strings, to be playing this with my colleague Alexis, who has a direct link with these people, absolutely directly back through his family. He has pictures on his wall of a signed photo from Dandy to his grandmother to my beloved student Madeleine. And I'm sure Dandy had plenty of photos from Franck to my beloved student Vincent. So this goes directly back. These are traditions that are a delight to carry on. Now, that being said, it's also our duty to make sure that things continue to live. I feel that the greatest duty a performing musician has is to make sure that composers continue to write good music. And I have commissioned a number of pieces from friends who are composers, from composers I admire, to write pieces for our group or for me, and I think nothing can be more important. Now, it's a funny thing because I don't know how many of you have paid any attention to discussions about modern music and how it's all garbage and how there's nothing great been written since Mozart or Beethoven or all that sort of thing. It is certainly true that the 20th century has been extremely problematic in terms of all the arts. And it is certainly true that the freedom that has developed in the 20th century, freedom to experiment in different forms, the freedom from set rules, the freedom from set traditions, one of the things that that freedom, that terrible freedom, has resulted in is a lot of self-indulgent fakery, also known as garbage. That's a problem. Because in the 20th century, anybody who does anything in any art form, in a sense, has had the responsibility of almost inventing the art form or inventing the language in which he or she is working at every moment. In the old days, this didn't seem to be such a problem. There were traditions, you worked within a tradition. Perhaps you expanded the tradition. Perhaps you did something revolutionary and broke the tradition wide open. But there were traditions. Everything was in a context of tradition. The 20th century, this great problem in the 20th century, I think, is the problem of context, of tradition. What do we do when anything is possible? Now, it is possible. It is indeed possible that the peak of musical compositional expression was reached in the 19th century. And maybe since Beethoven, there's been nobody of that level. Yes, there have been other great composers, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, all sorts of wonderful people on through the 19th century. Then into the 20th century, yes, we have some great composers at the beginning of the 20th century, although at that point, they're all individuals. There are no schools of composition anymore in the 20th century. It's all this individual, that individual. Stravinsky made a fantastic contribution. Is there anybody else who's like Stravinsky? Not really. Debussy. Anybody else like Debussy? Some imitators, but no. Maybe it peaked. Maybe the form of musical expression that we find the most effective, the language of musical composition, maybe it peaked 100 years ago. There are lots of people who would argue, oh, no, it's always going up, it's always going forward. Progress. Everything is progress. Well, it's possible that everything isn't progress. Nonetheless, and the reason I say it's possible is because let's look at the history of all civilizations, Greek civilization, Roman civilization, any of the great ancient civilizations, Egyptian civilization. These civilizations reached what historically now, from a distance of a couple of thousand years, we say were their peaks. And then they declined. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Famous historical work, right? The rise and the fall is normal. Well, perhaps we're on the downward slope. It's possible. Nonetheless, we have a choice. We can just say, well, we're on the downward slope. That takes care of that. I'm going to sit around and be miserable for the rest of my life and hope I don't get hit by a car. Or you can say that nonetheless, it is my duty to try to be involved in something worthwhile and something beautiful. Maybe it won't be Beethoven, but maybe it will be worthwhile. Maybe it will be beautiful. And that's what I think is important about commissioning new pieces, about playing new pieces of music. That it keeps alive the idea of trying to create works of beauty, works that will move us, works that will touch us. I'd like to talk a little bit about what a composer tries to do with a piece of music. What's involved? Because you can see forms, you can learn technical terms, the sonata form and the rondo form and the this form and the that form. But what I'd like to try to give you a little bit this morning is an idea of, one of the things I'd like to offer is an idea of how to listen to a piece of music, to think what a composer is trying to do. And I think that we have to go back to this idea of narrative. There are two things that people are interested in when they listen to a piece of music. That's to be moved and to hear something that makes sense, that is coherent. Music passes the time. Very often in in our group, we'll kid around before we're going to play a piece that lasts a half hour, say. Before the first note, we say, well, see you in a half an hour. And it's true. Nothing can interrupt. Once the piece of music starts, it lasts a half hour. That time is taken. This piece of music takes time. It passes the time. What the composer is trying to do is make the time pass in a certain way. Make it seem either quickly or slowly or uneasily or easily or beautifully or however. This is what the composer is trying to do, is work with time, is to make time pass both beautifully and coherently. So the structure of every piece of music has to do with a narrative, story. And I would say that the center of Western music, I'm not qualified to speak of other musical traditions. The central aspect of Western music, central structure of Western music, is essentially of every piece of Western music, no matter what language, no matter when it was composed and what musical language it uses, harmonic language, melodic language, rhythmic language. Music pieces start from a foundation, a starting point. They travel on some sort of journey to an area of tension or unease or interest or mystery or contrast or change, and then eventually the tension is resolved. Now, I don't know, have any of you have a training in harmony? You know what? I start using words like tonic and dominant key and all that sort of stuff. No, okay. I talked about hundreds of years of development going into the way instruments are made, the way music is put together. Well, the language of harmony in Western music is a language that has developed over 100 years to do just what I'm talking about, to give you a sense of where you start, what key you're in, what's the home base, the chord that is the basis of the key, then to take you on a journey away from that area of harmony to a different area of harmony, and then eventually to bring you back to the original key, to the original tonality, to the original home base, the original note that is the center. That progress, that ability to take us from here to there is what music is all about. And I would suggest to you that no matter what piece of classical music you listen to, that you listen with that in mind, because it will make it more coherent for you. You can hear that somebody's starting off here, they're going there, which is different, and one way or another, they're coming back, emotionally. We, for some reason, human beings like to have our emotions played with. This is what I mean by the need for narrative, the need to be told a story, the need for enjoyment, the need for pleasure, the need for even to experience sadness vicariously in a work of art. We seem to have a need for this. Now, nowadays, I think we think of these things as our rightful expectations. In modern society, we not only figure that we're going to have to work and we're going to have to make a living, but that we are entitled also to pleasure, that we're entitled to be told stories. I think that this whole idea of pleasure, expectations, has changed in recent history. It used to be that the only thing that really counted was duty. Your duty was to make a living. Your duty was to feed your family. Anything else that came along, well, came along. I read a book when I was in high school by an Indian author called Nectar in a Sieve. I always thought that was a beautiful image. Nectar, beautiful, wonderful, sweet substance, the joys of life in a sieve. Just going out through a sieve and trying to get little bits of it before it goes out in the sieve. My point is that even when duty was the most important aspect of human existence, when responsibility, when necessity was the most important aspect, because now we're all spoiled. We expect diversion. We expect fun. We expect to choose jobs that we like. We expect to choose spouses whom we love. These are relatively new concepts. In the old days, marriages were arranged. You went into the job that either your father or mother was in, or you did what you had to do. You did what was possible. You tried to make a living by the sweat of your brow. You earned your bread, and that was that. Now we want to do things we want to do. But even in the days when duty and responsibility and necessity was important, People sang their children to sleep. People listened to storytellers. People sought out this kind of, this being moved, this quality of being moved. And that's what goes on in a piece of music. That's why we listen to a piece of music. Why do we listen to music? We don't have to. At any given time, we don't have to. But then I come back to the thought experiment. Suppose it didn't exist. All the pop tunes that we hear that I listen to in the radio when I turn on the oldies station, all of that, that's based on Western harmony. All those pop tunes, rock and roll tunes, whether it's U2 or whatever there must be some new groups, and I'm not too informed on the latest in rock and roll trends because I'm still listening to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But all of these songs are based on Western harmony that was developed by people like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. These are all very standard harmony. And they wouldn't exist without this need to be moved. We want to be moved. And that's what all pieces of music are doing. What's then interesting, we've talked about the physical component about it. That's one of the things that I find fascinating. Have this physical involvement, a physical effort that makes the sound a physical effect that then becomes an emotional effect. But there's also, which has been implied, I hope, in the things I've been seeing, this remarkable tradition, this remarkable development intellectually, almost scientifically, you might say. The Greeks, nobody has yet surpassed the Greeks in their scientific analyses of acoustics and of frequencies and of the relationships of sounds and pitches and notes. And the developments of these C major chords or G major chords or keys that a piece is in. And every rock tune that you hear on the radio, by the way, just like most classical pieces, are in keys. Beatles tunes are in a key. They might be in C major, F minor, or B flat, whatever it is. But this is all the development of the working of the mind, the very assiduous working and study of the mind. People who developed systems of harmony, people who developed systems of musical language, not to mention systems of notation. We take it for granted that we can write music, right? I go up to the blackboard or the whiteboard, whatever it is. This thing work?
It does if you bring your own.
Oh, okay. Now, how many of you have seen a musical staff, right? 5 lines, right? And maybe this symbol in front of it, right? And notes that look like that, or that look like that, or that look like that. Something like that. You've all seen these things, or on cute little tote bags where somebody goes like this, right? Have these little notes, and hi from the Washington Opera, or whatever, right? You've all seen notes, right? Well, that's pretty ugly. Or you've seen a piano score maybe that has that, and then below it, it'll have another staff with this symbol like that, and then other notes, right? And it might have this little thing there like that. We take that for granted. Well, sure, that's the way you notate music. The history of musical notation is fascinating. It's incredible.
I got a shower curtain. It's a see-through shower curtain, and it has a sonate on it. And the page of the sonate, and I never looked at it. I mean, that's what you think, well, what does it mean? I never even thought about it.
Pages of what, I'm sorry?
Sonate, S-O-N-A-T-E.
Sonate. Yeah, that's the French word for sonata, which is Italian.
It's on my shower curtain.
Right.
So it's black, but I've never looked at it.
Mm-hmm.
The letters were there, but
there you
I
go.
thought about it.
Right. Musical notation. Well, there was a time, hundreds of years ago, where it was assumed that it was impossible to notate music. Couldn't be done. Then people started developing ways. They tried to figure out ways. The things that we take for granted in terms of notating rhythm. That this is a quarter note and that's an eighth note and it lasts twice as long as that. That didn't start out that way. That started from very simple ways. Now it's slipping my mind. Goodness, how could I? First of all, notes used to be called by different things they're called now, and also in terms of how fast a piece should go. Well, there was not a tempus. What was it called? Oh, goodness. There was a standard of measurement. First of all, in original notated music, written music, all music was in 3, in triple meter. Why was it in 3? Because Western composition started out in Italy, started out in the church, and it had to be in 3 to represent the Holy Trinity of all things. Imagine that. That this is one of the important bases for the beginnings of rhythm, for the beginnings of meter. So it goes way back. It's very interesting, fascinating, complicated, but just this notation. And isn't that fascinating? The piece of Bach that I played for you just a little while ago in fact looks like that. Well, does that sound like anything to you? No, that's just black notes on a page. It's just a system of notation. But this is one of the great aspects of genius of Western music, that this comes alive. First of all, that somebody figured out, not somebody, but many people developed over the years ways to notate exactly what sound should sound like. What will be the pitch? What will be the rhythm? Rhythm, by the way, is from a Greek word which means flow, which is very interesting. It's pretty appropriate. What will be the meter? How will it be divided? In what groups? Will it be divided in groups of 2 beats, in groups of 3 beats, in groups of 4 beats? Somebody had to come up with this, and then my job as a musician is to translate that into this. You know? Now, that's a fascinating relationship, actually, between this dead thing here and this extremely living thing. And by the way, when we talk about playing old music, yeah, it's a couple of 100 years old. Doesn't sound old, though, does it, when I play it? Etc. But it's pretty alive. It's right here. I'm doing it right now. You're hearing it right now. Nothing could be more present. Nothing could be more alive. And I think I'm jumping around from subject to subject here, but if we come back to this idea of good gifts, what's good lasts. It lasts because it's good. And if it's good, it's always good. When you look at a beautiful painting, if you look at a Rembrandt, it was beautiful 300 years ago, it's beautiful now. The reason we still look at it is because it still moves us. The reason we still listen to a piece of Bach is because it still moves us. It still affects us when it's in the here and now, and it is in the here and now. What preserves it is this, the genius of having figured out how to notate it. Then what preserves it is handing on these traditions of how to play, learning. And the tradition of interpreting this, because in fact, there are no what's called dynamic markings in Bach. It doesn't tell you when to be loud or when to be soft. Later composers, yes, that developed, and the instructions are more detailed. But in Bach, you pretty much have to decide for yourself. Those are just traditions of interpretation. The tradition of learning what good taste is in music. And what does good taste mean? It means what's going to be more beautiful. Right? If I start out this, well, I could start it out like that, or I could start it out, or I could start it out without excuse me, without vibrato, without the shaking of the fingers. Or I could start out with the bow going the other direction. Or I could start out. I've got a huge range of choices. Part of the tradition of learning to play the instrument and studying the music is learning what's going to be beautiful, what works, what's important, what's going to keep alive, how is it going to stay good. And I think that when something, again, when it's good, it lasts because it's good, and it stays good. It's always good. And that's one of the great joys of being in this profession, of being a musician. I make my living dealing with some of the most beautiful things that people have ever created. It's okay, it may be a tough way to make a living in terms of there are ways that are easier to make bigger bucks faster. But still, I feel like we're spoiled musicians because we spend our day rehearsing, well, how can we make this more beautiful? This is beautiful, but how can we make it more beautiful? Well, that's a nice job. You come right down to it. But, okay, so we have the genius of notation. We have the genius of instrument making. We have the tradition of expressing what is beautiful right here and right now so these things stay alive, so they stay good. Yes?
What makes a piece of music good? Say a piece by Bach or a new, like Milli Vanilli, a song by him. What makes one piece of music superior?
Bach can't compare to Milli Vanilli, obviously, and that's something we all know. No, I mean, Milli Vanilli is here in Bach. That's a very good question. It's really, isn't it? It's a basic question. I was involved in a conversation the other evening where there's the famous Latin expression, de gustibus non disputandum. There's no disputing taste. Right? If you think something is good, it's good. If somebody else thinks it's bad for them, it's good for you. Whatever. The category that I find interesting is the subjective yet indisputable. In other words, yes, it's a matter of taste, but it's indisputable, even though it's a matter of taste. Now, you picked that example to make an ironic, kind of sarcastic example. Why? Because it's obvious that Bach, who has already lasted 300 years, and who is generally considered by anybody who is at all familiar with the traditions of music, who is educated in music, who's listened to music, who is used to music, and who has also listened to Milli Vanilli, there is no question in the mind of anybody that Bach is a great figure in the history of music and Milli Vanilli is not. Can you prove it? You can't prove it. Suppose somebody comes up to you and say, oh, well, I like Milli Vanilli like really much better, like Milli Vanilli is like, and Bach is like, he's like dead, so I'm like, Milli Vanilli. This is where, I think it's great. That person is wrong. Okay, but how do we know that the person is wrong? Good question. There are things that you can discuss. You can discuss the originality of the work. Everything that Milli Vanilli has done is completely derivative. It's just a copy of something else. Nothing that Milli Vanilli has done would be possible without Bach. The harmonies and the harmonic language and the traditions that Bach was very much involved in developing are the very traditions that Milli Vanilli songs are based on, except they're based on it in an extremely simplistic way. So you can look at things like complexity and simplicity. But ultimately, complexity and simplicity, there are wonderfully simple things that are remarkably beautiful and worthwhile. So that only goes so far. If you just measure popularity, that's not necessarily valid either, because at certain times, sure, there are more people in the world who listen to Milli Vanilli and like Milli Vanilli than who know Bach, just the way popular culture works and dissemination of things. So, why is Bach better? The test of time, I think, is important. The generalized judgment of history. Now, generalized judgments change, it's true. But Bach died in 1750. There are more performances of Bach every day all over the world of his 1,000 or so pieces than there ever will be of Milli Vanilli. You can also be perfectly sure that within 5 years, or now, nobody will be playing Milli Vanilli. But I think that it's our responsibility, each of us, to be able to figure out individually why Bach is more worthwhile. This is a very dangerous area, by the way, hierarchies. What's better? It's very, very loaded, because nowadays there's a tremendous pressure for everything to be relative. Every art form is worthwhile, every culture is equal, everything is equal to everything else. You can get into very big, sometimes very nasty arguments about that sort of thing. Although you can tell by people's choices, even if people say, well, this is equivalent to that. When somebody is espousing a political position or something, or a position about cultural this or cultural that, if you want to know what they really think, watch the way they live. See what they do. And that'll tell you what they really believe, not the argument that they make. If somebody says, well, it's just as valuable to have no possessions and to wander around and live on steam grates, I don't see why that's any less valid or worthwhile than living in a nice house with furniture in a backyard. That's fine. Watch what choices they make. If everything that they do points towards finding a way to be able to have a nice little house or apartment with a little backyard and whatever, then chances are that's what they really believe. They believe it's better. With Bach, we just have to see what the pieces do to us. How do they make us feel? What do they accomplish? What is the science involved with them? And again, there are some things that the more you know about something, the easier it is to analyze. It's very hard to have these discussions, really, even about the quality of something, without having studied the language of the individual involved. It's hard to evaluate the relative worth of Bach without knowing a little something about harmony and musical forms and what he developed. On the other hand, I will say this. If I put you in a room for a few weeks and you had to, for 2 weeks, listen to 300 different pieces of Bach, and then for 2 weeks, listen to the 12 Milli Vanilli songs over and over, I think you would be able to make a judgment. You'd also be able to make a judgment listening to Bach and listening to a lesser composer. I mean, that's very interesting. It's good to know. The more we know, the more we're able to enjoy things and appreciate things. But the job of a good composer is to be able to communicate to people without their having any particular technical knowledge or technical skill or technical ability. If you liked the pieces that I played on the viola, if it sounded nice to you, nice. If it sounded nice to you, if you enjoyed it. It's not because you had any technical training. It's not because you're a specialist in Baroque music, which is what I was playing. It's because somehow this composer found a way to write music to affect human beings. Because this composer learned in his tradition a musical language, a way to move us, a way to tell a story, and a way to get to us. And if I've done my job because I've studied hard enough and worked at it enough and maybe have enough talent to be able to express it in a way that's convincing. I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question. Maybe it's because it's too hard a question, but I hope these are little bits. I think if you listen to what's good next to what isn't good.
So you're saying there's a certain skill you could put music into to judge it? So,
well, yeah, it may not be a specific scale, but I think that any of you ever heard of this book, came out 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yeah,
Robert? Robert Pirsig, yeah? Terrific book. I recommend it very, very highly. Neat book. It's about philosophy, but it reads sort of almost like a thriller. I mean, it's a philosophical thriller. The author, Pirsig, talks about something that he calls simply quality. I think he puts a capital Q on it. And quality is something, a good gift, if you want to call it, something that has quality, announces itself, in a sense, and convinces us by its quality. And here we get into the realm of what is a matter of taste, yet is indisputable. If you listen to Bach, if I made you listen to Bach for 2 weeks, and then I made you listen to Vivaldi for 2 weeks, or Telemann for 2 weeks, 2 other Baroque composers, I'm sure, I'm willing to bet that you'd come back and say to me, Bach was a greater composer. Now, many of you saw the movie Amadeus a few years back. Amadeus, maybe you did. Amadeus has to do with Mozart and his relationship with a composer who was much more famous and successful at the time named Salieri. I don't think there's anybody in the world who would say that Mozart isn't the better composer than Salieri. Mozart is, by general acclamation, one of the great musical geniuses we've ever had. Salieri, every once in a while somebody plays one of his pieces, but nobody cares much. Can you prove that Mozart is better than Salieri? I don't know. But Mozart is better than Salieri. It's indisputable. You cannot dispute it. If you do, you're a fool. That's what's interesting. This realm of what is subjective yet indisputable. Very tricky. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have to be an expert or just knowledgeable of music in order to appreciate it?
I hope not. I hope not. I really hope not. And I don't think you do.
I mean, none of what the artist puts into it, because what the artist put into the music, doesn't that have to be transferred? And what would you have to say? Could you say that you need to have knowledge of that artist?
I think the more knowledge you have chances for appreciation on more levels. The more you know about something, the more you can appreciate it. Take baseball. Somebody hits a home run. Well, that's neat. That's exciting. We all know it's a home run. But suppose you also know that there were 2 men on base, there were 2 outs, there was a full count. Well, let's say somebody hits a triple even. Not a home run, but a triple, a long hit. It goes all the way and it hits the back fence. That's neat. Everybody claps. But suppose you also know that there were 2 men on base, that there were 2 outs, and that it was a full count, which means that the runners were going to be going on the pitch. That makes it more exciting because you know what's going to happen on the pitch. Why are they going to be going? Because with 2 outs and a full count, if the guy throws a ball, then it's a walk and the runners advance anyway. If he throws a strike, if the batter strikes out, everybody's out anyway, so it doesn't matter. So they can run. They can take that extra chance. With 1 out, they can't do it because if they start to run and they get caught off the base, they'll be thrown out and that'll be the end of the inning. But with 2 outs and a full count, they can run. Well, that's neat when you know that. It's neat when you know that the pitcher has a good curveball and not much of a fastball, and that he's going to try this curveball on a 3-2 count, and it's risky. The more you know about baseball or basketball or football when you watch it, the more levels of enjoyment you have. Sure, it's always fun to see a home run. Sure, it's always fun to see somebody score a touchdown. But the more you know about what went into it, the more levels of enjoyment. So I would say that, on the one hand, it is absolutely the composer's job to write music in a way that you don't have to know anything about the technique. That's his job, the technique of writing music. You shouldn't have to know anything about it to be able to hear this piece of music and find it satisfying on some level.
Could you say then that you can perhaps enjoy it, but could you really appreciate it?
That's an interesting distinction. That's an interesting semantic distinction.
You were also, you were talking about the traditions, and how it's sort of been lost. So could you really appreciate that music if you didn't know those traditions?
I think you wouldn't. I think that you can appreciate it. I think that at a certain point, enjoyment and appreciation can be equivalent, at least for a while. I think there is no question that the more you know about your traditions, the more you have an idea of what to listen for, the more you know what goes into it, the more you're going to appreciate it, but also the more you're going to enjoy it. Maybe it's the same thing. I don't know. What is appreciation? Appreciation, I hear the word as having more of a component of understanding, comprehension that involves some sort of analysis, whether passive analysis or actually analyzing. You know what's going on. I mean, when I see a string player playing, I know what's hard, I know what's easy, and somebody does something really hard, really well, I think, that doesn't necessarily make it more moving. So you have all these different levels that contribute, but again, I think it's the composer's job Look, if everybody in an audience who listened to a concert needed to be an expert and needed to have a lot of technical knowledge, I wouldn't be able to make a living at all. You know? We play concerts. There are some musicians, and I really don't like this at all, who are snotty about audiences who don't know anything. Well, yeah, it always feels great to play for people who know a lot and who appreciate. But frankly, it feels great to play for people who just think it sounds really nice and who buy tickets and who make it possible for me and us to do what we love to do and do well. So I think there's room for an entire range, for a whole range. And the more you listen, see, I think listening to a lot of music before you have a technical knowledge builds an appreciation for the tradition just in itself. If you listen to the radio every day, if you turned on GMS or ETA, I have 3 radio stations set on my dial. I've got GMS, an ETA, and XTR, which is the oldies rock station. If you listen to classical music just a little bit every day, these traditions, some of it sinks in. You hear more, you know what to listen for. Let's say you hear a piece of Bach played on the radio today. And let's say 3 weeks later, you hear that same piece played by somebody else, and you think, I don't like this as well as I like that other performance. And then you hear it. I mean, that's some of learning traditions is just being exposed, just listen to it. But my job as a performer is to make it interesting for you right away. If you were interested, if you enjoyed what I did before when I played that little Baroque piece, first of all, the circumstances are perfect. You're right there, I'm right here, you have that experience of it, which is, unfortunately, because of the economics of concert life nowadays, it's very rare to have such intimate experiences, to have that kind of range. But if you liked it, then the composer's done his job, I've done my job, and you might want to hear something else like it again. For example, Sunday night at the concert hall. And that's a very interesting thing. You know, economics affects everything. Chamber music. I haven't even talked about chamber music here. I'm a chamber musician mostly. That's what I make my living doing. I have a chamber music group. Chamber from the word room. Chambre, Kammer, German. Kammermusik, musique de chambre. Chamber music was meant to be played in small spaces, in rooms. The only people who used to make livings from chamber music were composers. Because chamber music was in the old days, people's home entertainment centers. Before VCRs and before TVs and before stereos, people played music in their home. On instruments, they had pianos, they had instruments. Composers made music from chamber music from selling their music, from publishing their music and selling lots of copies of it. The way the original Tin Pan Alley composers, George Gershwin, before he was a Broadway success and all, they made, or Irving Berlin, they made zillions of dollars with a popular song because everybody bought a copy of the sheet music to play at home and to sing through at home. There was no such thing as people who made a living performing chamber music. But now, we do try to make a living performing chamber music. People present concerts, and because of the economics of it, you have to have enough people in the hall to buy enough tickets to make enough money, not to mention raising money. And so you wind up playing chamber music in concert halls where sometimes, you know, you need binoculars to see the person and earphones or microphones to hear the person. And that's, unfortunately, the economic realities have sometimes forced us away from the intrinsic and essential nature of things, which is too bad. There's nothing better than playing a musical instrument for somebody right there, so that the vibrations are right there, so that you can see the eyes. Who was it that said that the eyes are the window of the soul? Go back to soul again. Who did say that, do you know? Where's that from? The eyes are the window of the soul. I don't know. It's out there. We'll have to look in our Bartletts. But
Sounds like Aristotle, but
everything that's smart sounds like Aristotle. Well, when you're this close, you can see somebody's eyes. You have a contact with a person. If we were playing chamber music, if we had 3 people or 4 people right in the middle here, I assure you that's a much more interesting and exciting experience than being 50 yards away at the back of the Kennedy Center Concert Hall or something.
How does it affect you when you hear even very well transmitted high-tech music through stereo? Here, you are a man who lives right next to a beautiful instrument. Talk about being touched by it. The vibrations go right through your body. By the way, it's thrilling to hear it.
Thank you.
Is reproduced music satisfying, a little remote for you?
Sure, it's satisfying. First of all, for lack of the real thing, we accept it and we have to accept it. And since quality does come through in many of these recordings. Yes, the person isn't there, but then you have the play of your imagination, which is also worthwhile. It's like reading a book versus seeing a movie. I don't know how close it is to that, but you listen to old recordings of people long dead. It's the only thing you have, and you have that wonderful sense of contact with them anyway. But that's also, I think, because of the physical nature of sound. Yes, the person isn't right there, but the sound waves are still